Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. As Hannah said, my name's Carol Hollier, and today I'm going to go through the principles of how you build a comprehensive and unbiased literature review. So it's principles and with a little bit of hands-on, but I would invite you to ask questions. I'm happy to delve into any of the particulars at any point that people want to do that. But I will now dive in. So, and I will hope, yes. So for this webinar, we're going to look at a roadmap for building your comprehensive and unbiased literature review. And so this will entail understanding principles, but also looking at potential hazards and the way that you can use the right tools and how those right tools will help and why they'll help you do this well. And then also how not only just to use the right tools, but how to use them effectively. And then along with the hazards, we'll also look at some of the poor habits that researchers can fall into that can disadvantage them in their literature review searching or in their literature searching. Finally, we'll look at resources that people can draw on to help them and that contain much of the material that I'm going to cover here today. So the first thing that I want to say is that with literature searching in the areas of the sciences of food and health, we have sort of a blessing of abundance. So there has been in science in general about a 3% increase in the amount of literature produced every year. But in this field, it's actually been going up at a proportion of about 10% per year. So you can see this chart doesn't have the very latest years, but this trend has continued. I need to update the chart. But this means that when you're doing literature searching, it's not a case of just trying to find a couple things. It's more of a case often of wading through a great deal of research and not missing the important things. So that shapes some of the challenges, but also the good things about doing literature searching in the field. So it's worth thinking about what it is that we want in a literature review. So of course, people do literature searching for reasons that aren't going to be tied to a formal literature review. So people can do briefer searches and they can do very, very comprehensive searches. But in general, you always want to have them have the same sort of characteristics. So if we define what a literature review is, it's the critical assessment of the literature relating to a particular topic. And the goal is to identify, evaluate, and synthesize the existing body of evidence, and then, keyly, with as little bias as possible. So if we think about the characteristics that we want to end up characterizing our review, we want it to be comprehensive. It should be systematic and reproducible. So this might be reproducible because you're publishing your search strategies, or more likely reproducible so that you can reproduce it yourself towards the end of doing the literature review, or if you have anybody questioning how you got the results that you did, it's easy to display and talk about them. And then finally, it should be objective. And all of these different elements actually build upon each other, and especially the objective characteristic hinges upon the first two, that your search is comprehensive and systematic. Basically, you need to be systematic to ensure that your search is comprehensive so that you know that you have captured in your searching all of the relevant literature for your question that you're investigating. And then when you are confident that you've actually captured the literature in a comprehensive fashion, then you'll know that you can be much more assured that you're actually being objective. So you're not having a skewed literature review because you missed some important literature. So I like to think I'm an optimist about human nature, that most people who have a biased literature review or results from their literature search do it because they're making errors in their searching and they don't really understand the whole process in as much depth as they ideally should. So they're missing things rather than that they're trying to maliciously skew the results. But the end result, if it's biased, is the same. So it's better to use the proper steps, the proper approaches to eliminate or definitely to make as negligible as possible any biases based upon your searching for what you find for your literature review. So I want to now bring your attention to the best practice for literature searching guide that we've produced at IFAS. And IFAS did quite a lot of research that predated writing the guide about the challenges that researchers in this field face when they're trying to do their literature searching. And the challenges that, for instance, lecturers who are working with postgraduates, with prominent researchers who are, for instance, on editorial boards, who are seeing submitted articles, see errors and the kinds of errors that they see people making in their research, particularly in their literature searching side of the research, the desk research. And so they helped us to identify common errors, and then we produced a guide which was then reviewed by the IFAS advisory board, which is made up of prominent food science and nutrition researchers around the world. And they reviewed what we wrote, they made suggestions, and helped shape it so that it's truly based in the community, and not just the community, but very successful, prominent people in the community, to help people who are researching do it well, and to succeed at it. And so you'll see from this screenshot of part of the guide, it's got some preface to it, what's literature searching, what's a literature review, what's critical appraisal, but then it's got step-by-step sections about the practical guide to literature searching. And there's different ways that you can think about literature searching, so stages. So in an essential way, you have 3 different stages. You have a planning stage, and then you need to search, actually, and then after you've searched and gathered together records in a comprehensive and systematic manner, then you want to screen the records. And so the records are the bibliographic records that tell you that literature exists, so that research has been written up. So it's not the full text of it, but it just is telling you that it's out there, and it may or may not be connected to the full text of that article. But it doesn't matter whether it is or not. What you're trying to do in your literature searching process is find out about the existence of research that has happened around the world at different times on the question that you are investigating. So another way to think about this is to look at a chart like this. And some of you will undoubtedly recognize this as being adapted from the Prisma flowchart, which is the reporting scheme for systematic reviews. So it's not exactly the same as a Prisma flowchart, but it is based on it. And the reason that we're looking at it here is because I think it really nicely encapsulates the approach that you need to take in your literature search in order to be both systematic and comprehensive, and therefore end up with an unbiased result. And so what you start with is actually the identification of those records. So you go out and you use the tools that are available to you to find out that the research has been produced. And you'll notice that next to identification, it says records identified through database searching, and then additional records identified through other sources. So a very important principle to bear in mind is that you don't want to, if you're trying to do a comprehensive review, just look in one source. You always want to look in more than one source. Depending on your question, that will dictate which ones are most appropriate, but you'll want to do some experimentation to figure out which ones are useful for you. And because you're looking in more than one source, then you'll end up with duplicate records, because the way it tends to work with databases is that there's often a lot of overlap, but then each of them will have some unique content. And it's the unique content in the different databases which makes it so important that you look in more than one. So you don't just constrain your search to one place. And then you go through the stage of first screening your records just from the abstracts. And so you'll exclude some because they're very obviously, even though they were picked up in your search, they're very obviously not actually relevant to what it is that you're looking for. And then with the remaining ones, you get hold of that full text. And that's when you have to read that and screen that and decide whether or not from the full text it belongs in your final review. So it's a matter of doing a big gathering at the beginning and then screening step by step until you're left with the things that are actually relevant and important. And by doing that large scale gathering at the beginning, you can ensure that you don't actually miss things if you had just started with a little one and just gone for the things that were really obvious and you could get the full text really easily. So, and then finally you pull it together and synthesize that literature for the maximum impact in the written review. So when we're going through the steps of doing a literature review, it's actually really good to start with the planning stage, as I said earlier. And one thing to do to plan for success is to make sure that you have a good reference management software program in place, are familiar with it, because that's going to make it much easier and much more efficient to do the steps in the proper order. And so these are just a few of the many different packages out there. There's no endorsement of any of them, but there is a very strong endorsement here of taking advantage of one. So many institutions will have an institutional subscription to one or more reference management software packages, or Zotero is free. There are other free options out there. So if you don't have an option for a subscription one, you can either decide to subscribe yourself or take advantage of another option. But knowing how it works and actually getting it in place before you start the literature searching process is worthwhile, because it will help set you up for success. Oops, that was way too far. So then the question is, there's so much literature out there. How are we going to approach finding the literature that we need? And so we need to find a manageable amount, and what the manageable amount is really varies hugely on your project. But using tools, understanding, thinking about the tools that you're using and using them in the best way will make this seemingly daunting process much more manageable, actually. So when you think of search tools, it's helpful to think of them in terms of whether they are designed for discovery primarily or for access primarily. And so this, depending on your background, will either be a very familiar concept or something that's not really familiar to you, especially at all. Because we all search through many different tools, but there are some that are specifically designed to help researchers find the research that they need. And then there's some that are designed to help you find research, but not necessarily in a comprehensive way. And if you're using those tools, then it's not going to help you come away with an unbiased review. So the things that fall on the discovery side are databases. And there are a lot of different databases out there. There are some that are citation index databases like Scopus or Web of Science, both of which are very broad. They have a lot of material. They cover, like Web of Science covers all sciences, plus it has some humanities and social sciences in there as well. Scopus too, it's actually pretty good for linguistics if you're doing that. But it's heavily scientific, but it's all disciplines within the sciences. And then you get more subject-specific databases, and you'll get things like CAB abstracts, which is focused heavily on agriculture in the broadest sense, and FSTA, which is focused on the sciences of food and health, again, in the broadest sense. And then you'll get things like, sports discus, which is focused on sports and everything to do with sports, from nutrition to medicine to just anything that's hinged on sport, just like FSTA is hinged on food. So you'll get different databases with different focuses, and the ones with the more discrete focuses, so like FSTA or CAB abstracts, will have beneath them a controlled vocabulary or a thesaurus, which is intended entirely to aid researchers in finding research from around the world and written at different times, so that you'll be able to pull it all together in one search, which, although citation databases, citation indexes like Web of Science and Scopus have author contributed keywords, and they have publisher supplied keywords. They don't have the same kind of subject focused thesaurus that helps you find the research that you need in a particular field. So because of different features of different databases, when you're searching them, you need to approach them slightly differently in order to get the best out of them. So on the other side of the spectrum are things that are actually, designed for access, but that often get used by researchers who don't think about these things, just because they've not been introduced to the concepts, might get used as a discovery tool. And so here I'm thinking of things like Science Direct and Springer, and SpringerLink and Wiley Online, so publisher platforms where they have the full text of all of the literature, research literature that they publish. But you cannot on Science Direct find any literature that's been published by any publisher except for Elsevier. So if you look at that in the fields of sciences of food and health, that means that if you were only to search Science Direct, you'd only be getting access to about 20% of the literature that is published in that field. So you get some of the important literature, definitely, but would you get a comprehensive view of the literature? No, you wouldn't. And so that would introduce bias into your literature review. Likewise, publisher platforms are research networking platforms like ResearchGate and academia.edu are only curated by researchers themselves, some of whom are very interested in curating their profiles, others of whom don't bother. And so you're not getting, again, the comprehensive research. So they're excellent platforms for networking. They can be excellent for keeping up to date on particular areas, following somebody who's important in a field, but you won't necessarily find out about you definitely won't find out about all of the literature that's been being published on a question. So it shouldn't be used as a discovery tool. It's more of a networking tool that can be useful for access. Google Scholar has all of its own both advantages but challenges, and it's used often as a discovery tool, but it doesn't have the same kind of features built into it at all that databases do to make them effective for finding literature in a comprehensive way. So I mentioned before how a thesaurus will underpin the most subject-specific databases. So here we're looking at the thesaurus entry for flavor. And this is in the FSTA thesaurus. And you'll see at the very bottom of the screen, it says it's used for flavor spelt the American way, or North American way, I should say, and also the word taste. And so this is important because different people use different words to capture the same thing, sometimes just different spellings of the same word. But if we looked at Google Scholar, you'd see that, pardon me. So if we searched for flavor, spelled any of those, either of the ways that you can spell it, or if we use the word taste, then FSTA would bring back the results that were about flavor, or about flavor with no U, or about taste. In Google Scholar, if we wanted to do the same thing, we'd have to do different searches. So if we search for flavor spelt with a U, these are the results that we get. If we add an S, then suddenly our results change. It's a different set. Oh, and I'm missing 2 of my slides there. That's frustrating. Pardon me, I'm going to see if I can find them.
While Carol is taking a look for that, just a reminder that if you have any questions at all, please just send them through using the chat function and we'll be able to discuss them at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, I really don't know where the slides went, but you'll trust me that when I say that if you search Google Scholar with flavor spelt without the U, you get, again, a whole other set of results at the top. And if you add an S to that spelling of flavor, you get a whole different set of results. But if we search for flavor here in FSTA, and here I just did it as a title search, you can see right away that we are getting back both variations, flavor with no U or flavor with a U. So it's being pulled together for us. So this is one of the ways in which these tools are built for discovery. And so they help you as a researcher discover a much more international set of results. So you could do these repetitious searches within Google Scholar, but it would be challenging. You'd have to make sure that you knew all the different variations that you want to use. And so this controlled vocabulary will help you do a lot of the work. And whether or not you actually go into the controlled vocabulary and pull it into your search, it is actually helping you be more comprehensive. So if we think then about what the next stages are, so you need to think about where you're going to search, and that's part of your planning process. Managing reference and thinking about how you're going to do that is an important planning process. And then you also have to think about defining your research question. And with that, it's helpful. We're actually going to go into the guide itself here. To make sure that your question itself is not too comprehensive. So this is a place where you're sort of going in the opposite direction than we were thinking about earlier, being absolutely comprehensive. So you want to make sure that your question is framed in such a way that you can manage the results. And so, of course, you're doing different research for different purposes. So you need to do the research that you need to do. But if you do too large a question, then it's going to be impossible to be comprehensive. And so there's different elements that can be included in a research question. So the health sciences often use what's called a PICO framework, which is patient intervention, comparator, and outcome, to frame a question. And it's not like, obviously, food science doesn't always have a patient, or is likely not to have a patient at all. But you can think of patient, the P is a subject, and there are different elements that you might want to pull into your question. And so if you're thinking about it, one thing that's quite important is to have more than one element. So you want to have the intersection of more than one thing. And of course, people do literature searches, literature reviews for different purposes. So it's not necessarily that you're going to be looking at an outcome for something. You might be looking at properties of a product, but you would have, again, at least two things that are intersecting with each other in your search. So if we turn next to the search strategy, then you can start to think about going out again. So needing to be comprehensive again in the way that you think about your search. So if we go and we use a matrix like this, where you have a research question at the top and then you break it down into its different elements, so the different things that are going to intersect with each other. If we look at the populated one, then you can see how you want to not just use the words that you come up here with yourself in your question, but you need to start doing some brainstorming about different ways that those words, those concepts, might be expressed in the literature. So, for instance, in this example with the thawing, how do safe thawing processes impact the sensory quality attributes of beef? You're not ever using natural language, so you're leaving out the how do and impact the. So you're just zeroing in on the concepts themselves, and then you're starting to think of different ways that those can be expressed. So you can go into a thesaurus and get ideas from that. So you can see that these categories are actually based on the way that a thesaurus entry is structured. So with broader terms and narrower terms, and then also different kinds of spellings. So, but it's not really strictly speaking anything more than a prompt, a chart like this. And then you need to, after you've started thinking about this, broadening out your search again to make sure that you'll actually find all the literature about your question. Then you need to translate that into a search within a database. And when you do that, you start to use the things that we use to build searches, so Boolean operators and truncation and possibly phrase searching or adjacency searching. And so you can find out a lot more about those different elements and possibilities for structuring a search here in this part of the guide. But if I go back again to my slides and we look at it a little bit with another question, so how does fusarium and grain affect gushing in beer? Then you can see here's a chart that has been filled out. And this chart, I should say, can really be a living document. So you, chances are, will brainstorm something and think it works and then decide it actually isn't bringing back the results that you want. And that's fine. That's actually a good thing. And this is thinking about the Boolean operators. So the ands are what you use to connect the different concepts, and ors are the ones that you are using as basically as synonyms or as different ways to express a single concept. And truncation, if you're not familiar with it, is a really very powerful way to type the beginning of a word and capture all the different endings that are possible for that word. So it's often worth trying truncation and seeing if you get some results that you didn't expect. Depending on how solid you are in knowing exactly the search terms in your question area, you'll know exactly where to truncate and you'll know whether truncation is appropriate or not. But when you're going into a new area with new terms, truncation is really, really powerful. And it's often something that you will retain in a search. So again, you can see then that as you're building the search, you may well decide to discard some of the terms that you came up with because they turn out not to bring back the results that you expected and needed and wanted. As a principle, when you are using a more specific focused subject database, you often want to use fewer of the concepts because there's already a constraint around the size of the literature. There's already, it's going to be about a particular thing. And so you don't need to specify within a much larger pool of literature. So if you're using a search in Web of Science or Scopus, which is really broad, you might be using 3 search terms, 3 search concepts. And if you're using a more focused database, you might actually find that you're getting better results if you drop one of those concepts. And so this is something that's also really important, is to have the flexibility in your search, that you don't expect that one search will work equally well in all the different places that you're searching, and that they will have different elements that will affect how it is that they're reacting to the searches that you build. And so if we look at this search in different search interfaces, you can see that this is one way that it can appear, in one that gives you separate search boxes, or it might appear as a series of built searches, or you might build it as just a one single search string. And each of those is actually the same search, but it has to be expressed in a different way depending upon the tool you're using. And so that's another thing that's very important, is to get to know how to use the tool that you're using well, so that you can get the best results from it. If we turn then to the next steps of what you do once you get a lot of results and you think that you've searched everywhere you should search, then we go and we start to screen for relevance from the abstracts. And one of the things that we learned from talking to researchers and people who are evaluating the research as it's being written up is that a surprisingly common thing that that early researchers might do is include a citation from something where they've clearly only read the abstract and not read the full text. And that is obviously very bad practice. And so it would be warned against. But another thing that's important with the screening is to realize that the abstracts can't cover everything that's in an article. So if what the abstract covers is relevant, but it doesn't cover everything that you're looking for, then that's a case where you should keep that and pursue the full text and see whether in the full text it has the information you need, rather than going the other way and exclude it. So when you can tell from the abstract that it's focusing on something entirely different, that's an excluded one. If it is not clear that it's actually, like it might be, but it's not clear that it's focusing on your question, that is one where you need the full text. And then when you're getting to the next point of screening for the full text for relevance and credibility, that's when you need to make sure that the place it's published is credible. So there are safety mechanisms built in some of the tools that are out there. So databases try to screen for predatory journals. We at FSTA feel really proud of the job that we do. That's one of the things that we really concentrate on. There's been a recent spate of research about predatory journals making their way into Scopus. So it's a big challenge. So there is some responsibility that falls with the researchers as well to if you're in doubt at all, if it's a journal, if the research is published in a journal that you're not familiar with, to do a little bit of sleuthing yourself if you have any questions or suspicions about the quality of the science that you're seeing. And then you also just need to see, is it actually relevant for my question, et cetera, et cetera. And so in the guide, we have a checklist of questions, which may be helpful. And then, of course, there are many, many different checklists that you can turn to, particularly for literature that is more in the area of the health sciences. That's very well developed, but we're working on developing it more in the food sciences as well for you. So you basically, to be comprehensive, start with a very big group of records, and so that you lay an eye on all sorts of them, and then make sure that you end up with the relevant ones in the end. So with the screening from abstracts, if you're doing a very, very large project like a systematic review, you would pull all the results that you get from a search in and deduplicate them with your reference management software, and then you would do the screening there. If you're doing a less formal project, you may well decide to only do the screening from the abstracts from the results screen in front of you and only import the ones that are relevant at that point. And that's a judgment call. It again depends on the size of your project, but it is either approach can be legitimate, but it is a bad idea not to just, it's a bad idea to only look in one place. When you start looking in multiple places, you will see the same records come up and again and again and again. But those are from the key, most important journals generally. And it's the literature around the edges that you're trying to capture from these multiple searches to make sure that you are not introducing bias into your literature review. So if you don't have really excellent library services, there's ways to work around that to get the full text of research articles. So this is a blog post that we recently published about that. So the point of this is just to reinforce once again that you don't want to be searching for the things that you can easily find as full text. You want to find out that things exist and then get your hands on the important stuff as full text. So in summary, for a comprehensive and unbiased literature review, you need to strategize to be comprehensive at every step in the search process, with the exception of making sure that the question itself is focused enough so that it will be manageable. Use tools in your search that are actually designed to help you be comprehensive, and make sure that you use more than one tool to make sure you're not missing something important. This is again because different literature is indexed in different tools, but it also helps protect you from yourself a little bit in case you don't search one or more of these in the optimal way. Build your search string with variations on terms, so use or and truncation when it's appropriate. And then take advantage of the controlled vocabulary that's built into certain databases whenever you can. And then finally, the last point that's quite important, that is another point that was emphasized to us from the advisory board, is don't artificially restrict your results to recent literature. I think that there is an impulse sometimes to do that based on the health sciences, where things move quickly and you don't want to be doing medical procedures based on old techniques and things like that. But in the sciences of food and health, it seems as though a very common mistake is only to look at the most recent stuff and not to build it on its historic basis, which means that research gets repeated It means that it makes a review biased because it's been missing stuff from not finding it, from not going back far enough. So we have various resources to help at ifas.org. We have webinars like this. We have a journal publishing guide. We have our blog for research skills, and then also one focused on food science topics, which is called Thought for Food. The best practice guide is not only available in English, it's also available in Italian, in Persian, in Spanish, and in Chinese. So we would encourage you to take advantage of any of these resources. We'd also encourage you to follow us on any social media that you happen to use. These are our various accounts. And I would like to open it up for any questions if there are any.
Thank you, Carol. That was fantastic. We haven't received any questions as of yet, so if anyone does have any questions they would like to send across, please do using the chat function. Alternatively, if you have any questions that come to mind later, please don't hesitate to get in touch either through social media or directly via email, and we're always happy to help. All of the great resources that Carol mentioned are available on our website for you to access at any time, and you'll also find details of future webinars, so we hope you find these very useful. As I mentioned at the beginning, we have recorded this session and we'll be sending the recording to everyone afterwards. And to the end of today's webinar, you'll be directed to a questionnaire about your experience today. We would be very grateful for any feedback that you can supply so that we can ensure future webinars are as beneficial as possible and expand our services in order to best support our customers and the food science community as a whole.
So I'd like to add also, if you're a librarian and you think it would be useful to adapt the best practice guide for your library, then we welcome that as well. So please do feel free to do that.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope you've enjoyed this look into understanding the search steps for a comprehensive, unbiased literature review and gained a better understanding of the FSTA search process.
Oh, it looks like we do have a question.
We have just received a question, just in the nick of time.
Yeah.
Okay, so the question we've had is, if you're doing a systematic review and want to record your search strategy, how would you do it if you eliminate a term like food when searching in a specific food science database?
That's an excellent question. And the answer is that with a systematic review, you need to record the exact search strategy for each database as it appears. So it's quite normal to have this as an appendix, or sometimes with electronic versions of articles, it's like a additional information, supplementary information section of the article, because it does tend to be quite lengthy. So you would note which database it is, and then you would write it out as step-by-step each part of the search, including any limits that are built into it. And so it would be very easy for somebody to replicate it in the database that you were using. And you also have to indicate which platform that database is on, because many databases like FSTA can be subscribed to on the Web of Science platform or the Ovid platform or the EBSCO host platform. And even though it's the same database, the search is configured differently on each platform. And there are strangely small discrepancies in the very small discrepancies in the results sometimes. So that is another part of what it is that you record. Sorry, my mail is popping up. I didn't turn that off before we started. So does that make sense? I hope.
I believe so. Thank you very much, Carol.
Yeah. I'd like to say that actually over this summer, a colleague and I are producing a guide to systematic reviews in particular. So the guide that is the best practice for literature searching is about good searching that is unbiased, but it's not about exactly systematic review searching, which is very specific, and it has some rules around it to actually do it well. And so this should be being released in the autumn, and we are really excited about it. And it will talk about how, I mean, amongst many other things, about reporting standards, including how you report your search.
Absolutely. So as we're hoping that that's going to be released within the next few months, we would recommend that if you're not already, to sign up to one of our mailing lists, which means that you'll be instructed directly as soon as any new features like this systematic review guide are released. And you'll be able to do that by following a link on the email of the recording that you receive later this week. Unless there's any other questions that anybody has, I believe we've come to the end of today's session. So thank you very much to Carol for her fantastic presentation and all of the information that you've provided, Carol. And thank you to everyone for joining us.